Chapter 1. The summer of 1964 began like any other in Brighton. The seaside town on England's south coast welcomed tourists with open arms, its famous pier stretching into the English Channel like a welcoming hand. The beaches filled with families seeking relief from the post-war years, children building sandcastles while their parents relaxed in striped deck chairs. The air smelled of salt water, fish and chips, and candy floss from the amusement arcades along the seafront. But all of that changed on the morning of June 15th, when Dorothy Hayes's body was discovered on the eastern stretch of Brighton Beach. George Patterson, a maintenance worker for the Brighton Corporation, found her at 5:45 in the morning. He'd been walking his usual route along the promenade, checking for storm damage from the previous night's rain, when he noticed something dark on the sand near the old breakwater. At first, he thought it was driftwood, or perhaps a bundle of discarded clothing. But as he climbed down the concrete steps to investigate, his stomach turned. Dorothy Hayes lay on her back, her summer dress torn and stained with blood that had turned dark brown in the night air. Her eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the gray morning sky. Her throat had been cut with such violence that Patterson could see the wound even from several feet away. He stumbled backward, retching, then ran back up to the promenade to find the nearest telephone box. Detective Inspector William Hartley arrived at the scene at 6:30, accompanied by Sergeant Peter Morrison and a team of uniformed constables. Hartley was a tall man with graying hair and a permanent furrow between his eyebrows, the result of 27 years in police work and 4 years fighting in North Africa during the war. He'd seen death in many forms, but murders were relatively rare in Brighton, a town that prided itself on being a respectable holiday destination. He stood at the top of the steps, surveying the scene below. The tide was out, leaving a wide expanse of pebbled beach exposed. Dorothy's body lay perhaps 50 yards from the water's edge, positioned near one of the wooden groins that divided the beach into sections. A canvas sheet had been erected around the body to shield it from the growing crowd of onlookers gathering on the promenade. "What do we know?" Hartley asked Morrison as they descended the steps. Morrison consulted his notebook. Victim identified as Dorothy Hayes, 23 years old, works as a chambermaid at the Grand Hotel. Lives with her mother and younger sister in Kemptown. Last seen leaving the Regent Ballroom around 10:30 last night. Alone? According to witnesses, she left with a group of friends, but separated from them at the bus stop on North Street, Morrison replied. Said she was going to walk home. It's only about a mile. Hartley knelt beside the body, studying it carefully without touching anything. The police photographer was already documenting the scene, his flashbulb popping periodically. Dr. Edmund Clark, the Home Office pathologist, stood nearby, waiting for permission to examine the victim more closely. The cause of death appeared obvious. A deep slash across Dorothy's throat had severed major blood vessels, likely causing death within minutes. But Hartley noticed other details. Her hands showed defensive wounds, cuts on her palms and fingers suggesting she'd tried to fight off her attacker. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and most disturbing, her shoes were missing. "Dr. Clark," Hartley said, standing up. "She's all yours." The pathologist moved forward with his medical bag. He was a thin man in his late 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a precise, methodical manner. He'd performed hundreds of autopsies over his career, and approached each one with the same careful attention to detail. Hartley watched as Clark conducted his preliminary examination, taking the victim's temperature, studying the wounds, noting the state of rigor mortis. After about 15 minutes, Clark stood and removed his gloves. "Time of death between 11 o'clock last night and 2 this morning," Clark said. "Difficult to be more precise given the cool temperature and exposure to the elements. The fatal wound was made with a sharp blade, possibly a knife or straight razor. Single stroke, left to right, suggesting the killer was right-handed and standing behind or beside her. Signs of sexual assault?" Hartley asked quietly. "I'll need to conduct a full examination at the mortuary," Clark replied. "But there's no obvious indication at this stage." Hartley nodded and turned to Morrison. "Organize a search of the beach. I want every inch covered from the pier to the marina. Look for the murder weapon, the victim's shoes, anything that might have been dropped or discarded, and get statements from everyone who was at the Regent Ballroom last night. I want to know if anyone saw Dorothy talking to strangers, if she seemed worried or frightened." "Yes, sir," Morrison said, already moving to organize the uniformed officers. Hartley remained on the beach as Dorothy Hayes's body was carefully loaded into the mortuary van. He walked the area himself, studying the sand and pebbles for any clue the killer might have left behind. But the previous night's rain had washed away any footprints or blood trails. If there had been evidence, the weather had destroyed it. By mid-morning, news of the murder had spread throughout Brighton. Reporters from the local papers arrived at the police station demanding information. Concerned parents kept their daughters home from work and school. The cheerful holiday atmosphere that normally defined Brighton in summer was replaced by an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Hartley held a brief press conference at noon, providing minimal details. A young woman had been murdered. Police were investigating. Anyone with information should come forward. He didn't mention the brutality of the killing or the missing shoes. Those details would be held back, known only to the investigators and the killer. That evening, Hartley sat in his office at the Brighton police station, reviewing everything they knew. It wasn't much. Dorothy Hayes had been a quiet, respectable young woman with no known enemies. She worked hard, helped support her family, and enjoyed dancing at the local ballrooms on her evenings off. There was no obvious motive for her murder. The post-mortem examination had confirmed what Hartley suspected. Dorothy had been attacked from behind, the killer grabbing her and pulling her head back to expose her throat. The blade had been extremely sharp, cutting through tissue and vessels with minimal sawing motion. There had been no sexual assault, which ruled out one common motive. Dorothy's handbag had been found near her body with her purse still inside, ruling out robbery. This was something else, something darker. Morrison entered the office with 2 cups of tea, setting one on Hartley's desk. The interviews at the ballroom didn't turn up much, he reported. Several people remember seeing Dorothy. She danced with a few different men, all locals who've been identified and interviewed. None of them followed her when she left. What about on her walk home? Hartley asked. North Street to Kemptown at 10:30. Someone must have seen her. We're canvassing the route, Morrison said. But you know how it is. People don't pay much attention to a young woman walking home at night. Not until something like this happens. Hartley sipped his tea, staring at the map of Brighton pinned to his wall. Somewhere in this town was a man who'd murdered Dorothy Hayes with shocking violence. Was it random? Opportunistic? Or had he specifically targeted her? The answer to that question would come sooner than Hartley expected, though not in the way he hoped. Chapter 2. For 3 weeks, Brighton held its breath. Police patrols increased along the seafront. Women were advised not to walk alone at night. The investigation into Dorothy Hayes' murder continued, but leads were scarce. Hartley and his team interviewed hundreds of people, followed up every tip that came in, but nothing concrete emerged. Then, on July 8th, it happened again. Patricia Chambers was found at dawn on Brighton Beach, her body positioned near the West Pier. Like Dorothy Hayes, her throat had been cut with a single brutal stroke. Like Dorothy, her shoes were missing. And like Dorothy, there was no sign of sexual assault or robbery. Hartley stood on the beach as the sun rose over the channel, feeling a cold dread settle in his stomach. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. This was a pattern. Brighton had a serial killer. The similarities between the 2 murders were impossible to ignore. Both victims were young women in their 20s. Both had been killed late at night or early in the morning. Both had their throats cut with what appeared to be the same type of blade. Both were found on the beach with their shoes missing. Dr. Clark confirmed Hartley's suspicions during the post-mortem. The wounds are nearly identical, he said, pointing to photographs of both victims laid side by side. Same angle, same depth, same clean cut. This was done by the same hand, Inspector. No question. Patricia Chambers had been a nurse at the Royal Sussex County Hospital, 26 years old, dedicated to her profession, well-liked by colleagues and patients alike. She'd been walking home from a late shift when she disappeared. Her route took her along the seafront, a walk she'd made hundreds of times without incident. But on the night of July 7th, someone had been waiting. The public reaction was immediate and intense. The Brighton Evening Argus ran a front-page headline, "Seaside Slasher Strikes Again." Panic gripped the town. Hotels reported cancellations. Businesses along the pier saw their takings drop dramatically. Parents forbade their daughters from going out after dark. The promenade, usually bustling with evening strollers, became deserted after sunset. The chief constable summoned Hartley to his office. "We need results, Inspector," he said bluntly. "The Home Office is breathing down my neck. The town council is in an uproar. Tourism is collapsing. Every day this madman remains free is another day of economic disaster for Brighton." "I'm aware of the pressure, sir," Hartley replied. "But this investigation takes time. We're dealing with a careful, methodical killer who leaves minimal evidence. Then find him before he kills again," the chief constable said. Whatever resources you need, they're yours. But get results. Hartley left the meeting and assembled his expanded investigation team. In addition to Morrison, he now had 6 detectives and 20 uniformed officers assigned full-time to the case. They set up an incident room at the station, with maps, photographs, and timelines covering the walls. The pattern was becoming clearer. Both victims had been alone late at night. Both were on or near the beach. Both were killed with extreme violence, but without sexual assault or theft. The missing shoes suggested some kind of trophy-taking, a signature behavior common in serial killers. Hartley consulted with forensic experts and criminal psychologists from Scotland Yard. They built a profile of the killer. Male, probably between 25 and 45 years old, physically strong enough to overpower the victims, familiar with the Brighton seafront, comfortable operating in that environment, likely lived or worked in the area. The trophy-taking suggested a need to relive the murders, to possess something personal from each victim. But profiles couldn't provide a name or address. The investigation needed evidence, witnesses, something concrete to point them toward a suspect. The breakthrough seemed to come on July 23rd, when they received a report of suspicious behavior. A shopkeeper on Ship Street reported a man who'd come in twice asking strange questions about knives. The shopkeeper, Arthur Reynolds, described the man as being in his 30s, average height, wearing a dark coat, despite the summer heat. Hartley and Morrison interviewed Reynolds that same day. "Tell us exactly what happened," Hartley said. Reynolds leaned forward, eager to help. "He came in about 2 weeks ago, looking at my selection of knives. I sell pocket knives, fishing knives, that sort of thing. He was very particular, wanted something with a sharp blade, easy to conceal. I sold him a folding knife with a 4-inch blade. Did you get his name?" Morrison asked. "No," Reynolds admitted. "Cash transaction, no questions asked. But he came back 3 days ago. Wanted to know about sharpening stones, how to maintain a blade's edge. That's when I started to feel uneasy about him. There was something odd in his manner, very intense." "Can you describe him in more detail?" Hartley asked. Reynolds provided a description that was frustratingly vague, average in almost every way, except for his eyes, which Reynolds described as cold and penetrating. The shopkeeper worked with a police artist to create a sketch, but the resulting image could have matched thousands of men in Brighton. Still, it was something. The sketch was distributed to every police officer in Sussex, posted in shop windows and published in newspapers. The public was asked to report any sightings of the man or anyone matching his description. Tips flooded in. Over the next week, police investigated dozens of leads. Men who looked vaguely like the sketch were stopped and questioned, but each one had alibis for the nights of the murders, or didn't match the profile in some other significant way. Hartley felt the investigation slipping away from them. They had 2 dead women, a vague description, and a town in the grip of terror, but they were no closer to identifying the killer. Then, on August 5th, he struck again. Chapter 3. Susan Fletcher was 21 years old, a student at the University of Sussex studying English literature. She'd come to Brighton 3 years earlier from a small village in Yorkshire and fallen in love with the vibrant seaside town. She was bright, ambitious, and full of life. Her body was found on the beach near the Palace Pier at dawn on August 5th. Same wounds, same missing shoes, same methodical brutality. This time, however, they had a witness. Harold Bennett was a fisherman who'd worked the waters off Brighton for 40 years. At 62, he still rose before dawn to check his nets and prepare his boat. On the morning of August 5th, he'd been walking along the beach toward the marina when he saw something that made him stop. A man, standing over something on the beach, even in the dim pre-dawn light. Bennett could see the man was doing something to whatever lay at his feet. Then the man straightened up, looked around quickly, and walked briskly toward the promenade steps. Bennett called out, asking if everything was all right. The man didn't respond, just quickened his pace and disappeared up the steps. Something about the encounter felt wrong, so Bennett walked over to investigate. That's when he found Susan Fletcher's body, still warm, blood pooling on the pebbles beneath her. Bennett ran to the nearest police box and raised the alarm. Within minutes, officers were scouring the area. Hartley arrived shortly after 6 o'clock, immediately seeking out the witness. Harold Bennett sat in the back of a police car, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm morning. He was shaken but coherent, and his description of the man he'd seen was more detailed than anything they'd had before. He was about 5'10", Bennett said, slim build, but looked strong. Wearing dark trousers and a dark jacket, had a hat pulled low over his face, but I saw enough to give you an idea of what he looked like. Can you describe his face? Hartley asked urgently. Long face, sharp features, Bennett replied. Prominent nose, clean shaven. Couldn't see his hair because of the hat, but I'd guess dark, based on his eyebrows. Did he see you clearly? I don't think so, Bennett said. The light was dim, and I was maybe 40 yards away. I called out, but he didn't look directly at me, just turned and left quickly. Would you recognize him if you saw him again? Maybe, Bennett said uncertainly. It all happened so fast. Hartley arranged for Bennett to work with the police artist immediately. By mid-morning, they had a new sketch, far more detailed than the vague image from the shopkeeper. This one showed a man with distinct features, a long, narrow face, prominent nose, deep-set eyes, thin lips. The sketch was distributed throughout Brighton within hours. Newspapers ran special editions. Police officers carried copies on their patrols. Surely someone would recognize this man. The public response was overwhelming. The police station was inundated with calls. People reported seeing the man everywhere, on buses, in shops, walking along the seafront. Each report had to be investigated. Each potential sighting followed up. One tip seemed particularly promising. A landlady in Hove, just west of Brighton, called to report that one of her lodgers matched the description. The man had moved into her boarding house 3 months earlier, kept irregular hours, and had a cold, unfriendly manner. Hartley and Morrison arrived at the boarding house that afternoon with several uniformed officers. The landlady, Mrs. Eleanor Forsyth, met them at the door, wringing her hands nervously. He's in room 7, on the 2nd floor, she whispered. Hasn't come out all day. Usually he's gone by now, off doing whatever it is he does. But today he stayed in, which isn't like him. What's his name? Morrison asked. James Whittaker, Mrs. Forsyth replied. At least that's the name he gave me. Pays his rent in cash, keeps to himself. I never liked him, truth be told. Something about his eyes. Hartley positioned officers at the front and rear exits, then climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. He knocked firmly on the door of room 7. Mr. Whittaker, this is the police. We need to speak with you. No response. Hartley knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Open it, Hartley instructed Morrison, stepping aside. Morrison tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back and kicked hard at the door near the lock. The old wood splintered and the door swung open. The room was empty. A single bed, neatly made. A wardrobe with a few items of clothing hanging inside. A small table with a chair, but no James Whittaker. Hartley moved to the window and looked out. It faced the back of the property, overlooking a narrow alley. The window was open. He's run, Hartley said grimly. He must have heard us arrive and went out the window. Morrison leaned out, looking down. There's a drain pipe, sir. He could have climbed down easily enough. Hartley turned back to the room and began searching systematically. In the wardrobe, he found a dark jacket and a hat matching Harold Bennett's description. In a drawer beneath the bed, wrapped in cloth, he found a knife. The blade was clean, recently washed, but Hartley could see faint traces of discoloration that might be blood. Get this to the lab immediately, he said, handing the knife to Morrison, and put out an alert for James Whittaker. Description from the sketch. Consider him armed and extremely dangerous. The manhunt was on. Every police officer in Sussex received Whittaker's description. Roadblocks were set up on major routes out of Brighton. The ports and railway stations were monitored. If James Whittaker was the seaside slasher, he wouldn't escape. But despite the intensive search, there was no sign of him. Days passed with no credible sightings. The knife found in his room showed traces of human blood, but testing technology in 1964 was limited. They couldn't definitively link it to the murders. And worse, they discovered that James Whittaker wasn't James Whittaker at all. The name was an alias. The real James Whittaker had died in Manchester in 1958. The man who'd been living in Mrs. Forsyth's boarding house had stolen a dead man's identity. They had no real name, no background, no way to trace where he'd come from or where he might have gone. Chapter 4. As August progressed with no arrests and no new leads, Brighton remained in a state of anxious fear. The beaches, normally packed with holidaymakers, were half empty. Women refused to go out alone after dark. The town that had welcomed thousands of visitors every summer now felt like it was under siege. Hartley worked 16-hour days, following up every lead, re-interviewing witnesses, searching for the pattern that would help them predict where the killer might strike next. He barely slept, surviving on tea and cigarettes, his face growing more haggard as the investigation wore on. His wife Margaret worried about him. "You're going to collapse if you keep this up," she told him one evening when he finally came home around midnight. "I'll collapse after we catch him," Hartley replied, too tired to argue. The pressure from above was relentless. The chief constable wanted results. The Home Office wanted results. The public wanted results. But wanting something didn't make it happen. Morrison tried to keep the investigation team motivated, but morale was low. They'd followed hundreds of leads to dead ends. They'd interviewed thousands of people. They'd searched miles of coastline. And they still had no idea who they were looking for, or where he might be. On August 27th, the worst happened. The killer struck again. Margaret Walsh was 28 years old, a secretary at a law firm in the city center. She lived alone in a small flat near the railway station and was known as a quiet, careful person who avoided risks. On the night of August 26th, she worked late, finishing urgent paperwork. She left her office around 10:30 and began the walk home. She never made it. Her body was found the next morning on the beach near the Hove border. Same wounds, same missing shoes, same cold brutality. 4 victims. 4 young women whose only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the police seemed powerless to stop it. The public response this time was different. Fear turned to anger. Why couldn't the police catch this monster? What were they doing with all their resources and manpower? Shouldn't someone be held accountable? A public meeting was held at the Brighton Town Hall, packed with hundreds of concerned citizens demanding answers. Hartley attended, standing on the stage beside the chief constable and the mayor, facing a sea of frightened, angry faces. "How many more women have to die before you do your job?" someone shouted from the crowd. "My daughter is terrified to leave the house," a woman called out. "What are you doing to protect us?" The chief constable tried to calm the crowd, explaining the scope of the investigation, the resources being devoted to it, the complexity of tracking a serial killer who left minimal evidence. But his words did little to ease the tension. Hartley stepped forward to the microphone. "I understand your fear and frustration," he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "I share it. Every day this man remains free is a failure, and I feel that failure personally. But I promise you this, we will not stop. We will follow every lead, investigate every possibility, work day and night until we identify and arrest this killer." The crowd was slightly mollified but still skeptical. As people filed out of the town hall, Hartley overheard conversations about vigilante justice, about taking matters into their own hands since the police couldn't protect them. "This is getting out of control," Morrison said quietly as they left through a side exit. "I know," Hartley replied. "We need a break in this case, and we need it soon." That break came from an unexpected source. A doctor at Royal Sussex County Hospital contacted the police about a patient who'd been admitted 3 days earlier with severe self-inflicted wounds to his hands and arms. The man had been found unconscious in his flat, having apparently tried to kill himself. What caught the doctor's attention was what the man had been saying while delirious from blood loss and infection. He'd been muttering about women, about blood, about being unable to stop. The doctor thought it might be nothing, just the ravings of a mentally ill man. But given the current situation in Brighton, he felt obligated to report it. Hartley and Morrison went to the hospital immediately. The patient was in a private room, under sedation. The attending physician, Dr. Richard Moss, met them outside the room. "His name is Edward Pritchard," Dr. Moss said, consulting his notes. 36 years old, lives alone in a flat in Kemptown. No known family, works as a clerk at a shipping company. Neighbors called for an ambulance when they noticed blood seeping under his door. "What exactly did he say while delirious?" Hartley asked. Dr. Moss pulled out a piece of paper where he'd written down the statements. He kept saying things like, "I had to do it. They made me. The voices won't stop." At one point he said, 4 of them, all gone. Another time he said, "The shoes. I kept the shoes." Hartley and Morrison exchanged glances. The detail about the shoes had never been released to the public. Only the killer would know about that. "Can we question him?" Hartley asked. "He's stable now, but still weak," Dr. Moss replied. "You can try, but I can't guarantee he'll be coherent." They entered the room. Edward Pritchard lay in the hospital bed, his arms bandaged from wrist to elbow. He was a thin man, with lank brown hair and a pale, sweaty face. His eyes were closed, but they opened when Hartley spoke his name. "Mr. Pritchard, I'm Detective Inspector Hartley. I need to ask you some questions." Pritchard's eyes focused on him slowly. He licked his dry lips. "Water," he croaked. Morrison poured water from a pitcher on the bedside table and held the glass while Pritchard drank. When he'd finished, Hartley began again. "Mr. Pritchard, you've been saying things while you were ill, things that concern us. Can you tell me what you meant when you said 4 of them?" Pritchard's eyes filled with tears. "I tried to stop," he whispered. "I tried so hard, but the voices, they wouldn't leave me alone." "What voices?" Morrison asked gently. "Them," Pritchard said, his voice becoming agitated. "The women. They followed me everywhere. In my dreams, in the street, at work, always accusing me, always judging me." Hartley leaned closer. "Mr. Pritchard, did you hurt those women?" Pritchard began to sob. "I didn't want to. I'm not a bad person, but they wouldn't stop. The voices said I had to make them quiet. I had to stop them from looking at me that way." "Where are the shoes?" Hartley asked quietly. "In my flat," Pritchard said between sobs. "In a box under the bed. I kept them because I thought if I had something of theirs, the voices might stop. But they didn't. They got louder." Dr. Moss stepped forward. "Inspector, I think that's enough for now. He needs to rest." But Hartley had heard enough. He had a confession. They had their man. A search warrant was obtained within the hour. Hartley, Morrison, and a team of officers descended on Edward Pritchard's flat in Kemptown. It was a dingy one-room flat that smelled of stale cigarettes and unwashed clothes. Under the bed, exactly where Pritchard had said, they found a cardboard box. Inside were 4 pairs of women's shoes, each pair carefully wrapped in newspaper. The dates on the newspapers corresponded roughly to the dates of the murders. In a drawer, they found newspaper clippings about all 4 killings. Pritchard had been following the investigation, reading about himself in the papers. And in the back of the wardrobe, wrapped in an oilcloth, they found a straight razor. The blade was clean, but tests would later confirm microscopic traces of blood belonging to the victims. Edward Pritchard was formally arrested while still in his hospital bed. He was charged with 4 counts of murder. The story dominated newspapers across Britain. The seaside slasher had been caught. Brighton breathed a collective sigh of relief. Parents allowed their daughters out again. Tourists began returning. The beaches filled once more with holidaymakers. Life slowly returned to normal. But for the families of Dorothy Hayes, Patricia Chambers, Susan Fletcher, and Margaret Walsh, there would never be normal again. Chapter 5. The trial of Edward Pritchard began in March of 1965 at Lewis Crown Court. It attracted enormous public interest, with queues forming outside the courthouse every morning as people tried to secure seats in the public gallery. Pritchard pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense attorney, a prominent barrister from London named Geoffrey Blackwood, argued that his client was suffering from severe schizophrenia and had not been in control of his actions when he committed the murders. The prosecution, led by Crown Attorney James Pemberton, countered that Pritchard had been fully aware of what he was doing, the careful planning, the selection of victims, the methodical covering of his tracks, all suggested a man who knew exactly what he was doing and took steps to avoid capture. Hartley testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the investigation, the evidence collected, the confession Pritchard had made in the hospital. He described each crime scene in clinical detail, showed photographs that made several jurors turn pale. Dr. Clark testified about the post-mortem examinations, confirming that all 4 women had been killed in the same manner with the same type of weapon. The razor found in Pritchard's flat matched the wounds perfectly. Harold Bennett identified Pritchard as the man he'd seen standing over Susan Fletcher's body. Though it had been dark, and he'd only seen the man briefly, he was certain enough to testify under oath. The defense called psychiatrists who examined Pritchard and diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. They described a man who heard voices, who believed he was being persecuted by women, who lived in a delusional world where violence was the only solution to his torment. One psychiatrist, Dr. Martin Ashworth, testified that Pritchard had experienced his first psychotic break at age 19. He'd been briefly hospitalized, but had been released without adequate follow-up care. Over the years, his condition had deteriorated, but he'd learned to hide his symptoms well enough to maintain employment and avoid institutionalization. The voices he heard commanded him to kill, Dr. Ashworth said. In his disturbed mind, the women he encountered on the beach were manifestations of his persecutors. By killing them, he believed he was defending himself against threats only he could perceive. But under cross-examination, Dr. Ashworth admitted that Pritchard had been capable of distinguishing right from wrong. He'd hidden the murder weapon. He'd taken trophies and concealed them. He'd avoided being caught for months. These were not the actions of someone completely divorced from reality. The prosecution also presented evidence of Pritchard's life before the murders. He'd held steady employment for years. He paid his rent on time. Neighbors described him as quiet, but functional. There was no history of violence, no prior arrests, nothing that suggested imminent danger. So what triggered the killing spree? Pemberton asked. Why did he suddenly, after years of apparent stability, become a serial killer? The answer seemed to lie in a series of rejections Pritchard had experienced in the spring of 1964. He'd asked out a coworker, who'd politely declined. He'd tried to strike up a conversation with a woman at a bus stop, who'd ignored him. Small slights, meaningless to most people, but to Pritchard's disturbed mind, they were evidence of a conspiracy against him. The voices, which he'd apparently been hearing for years, became more insistent. Women were dangerous. Women were enemies. Women needed to be silenced. And so, on the night of June 14th, when he saw Dorothy Hayes walking alone near the beach, something inside him snapped. He followed her. He grabbed her, and he cut her throat. After that first killing, the compulsion became overwhelming. He couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't escape the urge to do it again. Each murder provided temporary relief from the voices, but they always came back, demanding more. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On April 9th, 1965, they returned with their verdict, guilty on all 4 counts of murder. The judge, Lord Justice Sir Harold Pemberton, sentenced Edward Pritchard to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 30 years before being considered for parole. He was also ordered to be detained in a secure psychiatric hospital for treatment of his mental illness. As Pritchard was led from the dock, he turned and looked directly at Hartley, who was sitting in the courtroom. There was no anger in his expression, no defiance, just emptiness. Hartley watched him go, feeling no satisfaction in the conviction. 4 women were still dead. 4 families were still grieving. Justice had been served, perhaps, but it didn't bring anyone back. Chapter 6. In the years following the trial, Brighton gradually healed from the trauma of the seaside slasher murders. The story became part of local legend, something older residents would mention when discussing the town's history. But as time passed and new generations arrived, the memory faded. For Hartley, however, it never faded. The case had taken a toll on him, physically and emotionally. He'd aged years in those few months of 1964, and though he continued working until his retirement in 1976, he was never quite the same. He kept a file on the case in his home office, returning to it occasionally, reading through witness statements and autopsy reports. Not because he doubted Pritchard's guilt, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that there were still unanswered questions. How had Pritchard selected his victims? Was it purely random, or had he been watching them beforehand? The flat where he'd lived had no evidence of surveillance equipment or notes about potential targets, yet he seemed to have known their routines, their routes, their vulnerabilities. And what about the man Harold Bennett had seen? The description matched Pritchard reasonably well, but Bennett had never been entirely certain in his identification. In the dim pre-dawn light, could he have been mistaken? These questions nagged at Hartley through his retirement. In 1980, he decided to revisit the case one more time, conducting his own unofficial investigation. He tracked down Harold Bennett, now 78, and living in a nursing home in Worthing. The old fisherman's memory was still sharp regarding that morning in August 1964. "I saw a man standing over that poor girl," Bennett said, his hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of tea. "And I testified that the man in the dock looked like him. But if I'm being completely honest, Inspector, I was never 100% certain. The light was poor. I only saw him for a moment, and by the time I testified, I'd seen his photograph in the newspapers so many times that I couldn't be sure whether I was remembering the actual man or just the pictures." This admission troubled Hartley deeply. Bennett's eyewitness testimony had been a key piece of evidence supporting Pritchard's conviction. If it was unreliable, what did that mean? He visited Edward Pritchard in Broadmoor Hospital, the secure psychiatric facility where he'd been held since his sentencing. Pritchard was now 52 years old, heavily medicated, a shadow of the man who'd terrorized Brighton. They met in a visiting room, separated by a thick glass partition. Pritchard looked confused when Hartley identified himself. "I remember you," Pritchard said slowly. "From the trial. You were the detective." "That's right," Hartley said. "I wanted to ask you some questions, if you're willing." "About what?" Pritchard asked. I confessed. I was convicted. What more is there to say? I want to understand why, Hartley said. Why those particular women? How did you choose them? Pritchard stared at him for a long moment. The voices told me, he finally said. They pointed them out, told me those were the ones who were threatening me, who wanted to hurt me. But the voices weren't real, Hartley pressed. You understand that now, don't you? I understand what the doctors tell me, Pritchard replied. That my mind was sick, that I created the voices from my own fears and paranoia. But at the time, they were as real to me as you are now. Did you know any of the women before you killed them? Hartley asked. Had you seen them before? Followed them? Learned their routines? Pritchard shook his head slowly. I don't think so. I was just walking, and I would see them, and the voices would start screaming. That's when I knew. The conversation left Hartley more unsettled than before. There was something about Pritchard's responses that didn't quite fit. A vagueness that could have been due to his mental illness and medication, or could have been something else. He returned to Brighton and spent weeks going through the old case files again. He reread every witness statement, reviewed every piece of evidence, traced every timeline, and he found something he'd missed before. On the night Susan Fletcher was murdered, a witness had reported seeing a man matching Pritchard's description near the Palace Pier around 10 o'clock. But Pritchard's time card from his job at the shipping company showed he'd been working until 11 o'clock that night. And his workplace was a 30-minute bus ride from the pier. The discrepancy had been noted at the time, but explained away. Perhaps the time card was wrong. Perhaps the witness was mistaken about the time. Perhaps Pritchard had left work early without clocking out. But now, reading through the files with fresh eyes, Hartley wondered if there was another explanation. What if the man seen near the Palace Pier at 10 o'clock hadn't been Pritchard at all? What if it had been someone else? He tracked down the witness, a woman named Janet Cooper who'd been walking her dog that evening. She was now in her 60s, living in Eastbourne. I told the police what I saw, she said when Hartley interviewed her. A man in a dark coat and hat, acting suspiciously near the pier. He was watching the people passing by, studying them in a way that made me uncomfortable. Did you see his face clearly? Hartley asked. Not really, Cooper admitted. He kept his hat pulled low, but I saw enough to provide the description I gave. Could it have been someone other than Edward Pritchard? Hartley asked. Cooper considered this. I suppose so. I picked Pritchard out of a lineup based on his general appearance and build, but I never saw his face clearly that night, so I couldn't swear it was definitely him. Another crack in the foundation of the case. Hartley returned home and spent a sleepless night going through possibilities. What if Edward Pritchard hadn't acted alone? What if there had been two killers working together, or separately but using the same methods? It would explain the inconsistencies in the timeline, the vague witness descriptions, the feeling that something didn't quite add up. But if that were true, it meant one of the Brighton Beach killers had never been caught. It meant the case wasn't as solved as everyone believed. Hartley took his concerns to his former colleague, Peter Morrison, who'd risen to the rank of Detective Chief Inspector. Morrison listened to Hartley's theory with growing concern. You're suggesting we convicted the wrong man? Morrison asked. No, Hartley said. The evidence against Pritchard was solid, he confessed. He had the murder weapon and the trophies. He killed at least some of those women. But I'm suggesting he might not have killed all of them. That's a serious allegation, Morrison said. If you're right, it means we stopped investigating too soon. It means there could still be a killer out there. I know, Hartley replied. That's why I'm bringing it to you. This needs to be looked at properly, officially. Morrison promised to review the case files and consider reopening the investigation. But weeks passed with no action. Hartley pushed harder, writing letters to the Home Office, contacting journalists, trying to generate attention for his concerns. The response was universally negative. The case was closed. Pritchard had been convicted based on overwhelming evidence. Raising doubts about his guilt now would undermine public confidence in the justice system and cause unnecessary distress to the victims' families. You're a retired detective chasing ghosts, one Home Office official told him bluntly. Let it go. But Hartley couldn't let it go. He continued his investigation privately, spending his pension on travel and research, alienating friends and family with his obsession. In 1985, he published a book about the case titled The Brighton Beach Murders, Unanswered Questions. It laid out his concerns about the timeline inconsistencies, the questionable witness identifications, the possibility of multiple killers. The book received minimal attention. A few local newspapers reviewed it, mostly dismissing his theories as the misguided obsessions of an aging detective who couldn't accept that. Some cases had messy loose ends, but one person took it seriously. A journalist named Catherine Walsh, no relation to victim Margaret Walsh, read the book and became intrigued. She contacted Hartley and proposed doing her own investigation, with his cooperation. Together, they spent 2 years reviewing every aspect of the case. Catherine tracked down witnesses who'd never been interviewed thoroughly. She found inconsistencies in the official timeline that had been glossed over. She discovered that several potential suspects had been dismissed too quickly because the focus had shifted entirely to Pritchard after his arrest. In 1987, Catherine published a series of articles in The Observer under the headline, "Did the Seaside Slasher Work Alone?" The articles generated significant discussion and led to calls for the case to be officially reviewed. A Home Office inquiry was launched in 1988. A panel of legal experts and forensic specialists reviewed all the evidence, interviewed witnesses, and examined Hartley's concerns. Their conclusion, published in 1989, was carefully worded. While Edward Pritchard was undoubtedly guilty of murdering at least 2 of the 4 women, based on physical evidence and his confession, there were sufficient inconsistencies and unexplained elements to suggest the possibility that not all 4 murders had been committed by the same person. The report stopped short of definitively stating there had been a second killer, but it acknowledged that the investigation had been closed prematurely and that some questions remained unanswered. It was a partial vindication for Hartley, but it came too late for any practical purpose. Edward Pritchard had died in Broadmoor Hospital in 1986, taking whatever secrets he knew to his grave. Epilogue. The Brighton Beach murders of 1964 remain one of the most controversial cases in British criminal history. 4 young women were brutally killed over the summer of that year. Edward Pritchard was convicted of their murders and spent the rest of his life in psychiatric custody. Case closed. Or was it? William Hartley died in 1992 at the age of 79, still convinced that important aspects of the case remained unsolved. His wife Margaret donated his extensive files to the Sussex Police Museum, where they remain available for researchers. In 2004, 40 years after the murders, a television documentary re-examined the case. Using modern forensic techniques and criminal profiling, experts analyzed the evidence anew. Their conclusions supported Hartley's concerns. While Pritchard had almost certainly killed at least 2 of the victims, possibly 3, there were aspects of the 4th murder, that of Margaret Walsh, that didn't quite fit the pattern of the others. Margaret had been killed on a different stretch of beach, slightly farther from the town center. The wound to her throat, while similar, showed subtle differences in angle and depth. And most intriguingly, her shoes had been found several days after her murder, discarded in a rubbish bin near the railway station, something that hadn't happened with the other victims. The documentary raised the possibility that a copycat killer, inspired by the media coverage of the first 3 murders, had killed Margaret Walsh. Or perhaps an opportunistic killer had used the seaside slasher panic as cover for his own crime. The truth may never be known. Edward Pritchard is dead. Harold Bennett, the only witness who saw the killer, died in 1989. Most of the other key figures in the case have also passed away. Brighton has long since moved on from those dark summer months of 1964. The town thrives as a popular holiday destination, its beaches once again filled with families enjoying the sun and sea. Few visitors know about the murders that once terrorized the community, but local historians remember. The Brighton Historical Society maintains an exhibit about the case, displaying newspaper clippings, photographs, and artifacts. On the 60th anniversary in 2024, a memorial plaque was placed on the seafront, commemorating Dorothy Hayes, Patricia Chambers, Susan Fletcher, and Margaret Walsh. The inscription reads, "In memory of 4 young women whose lives were taken in the summer of 1964, never forgotten." And in a file room at Sussex Police Headquarters, the case remains technically open. Because while Edward Pritchard was convicted, while justice was served in some form, the uncomfortable truth is that questions remain, doubts persist, and somewhere in the historical record of that terrible summer, there may be clues that were never properly examined, connections that were never made, a truth that was never uncovered. The seaside slasher was caught. Of that, there is no doubt. But was he the only one? Did Brighton suffer from 2 killers operating simultaneously, their crimes blurring together into a single narrative of terror? William Hartley believed so until the day he died, and though his theory was never proven, it was never definitively disproven either. Sometimes the most disturbing aspect of a crime isn't what we know, it's what we'll never know. And in the case of the Brighton Beach murders of 1964, that uncertainty lingers like a shadow over a sunny seaside town, a reminder that some mysteries resist resolution, no matter how desperately we seek answers. The official record states that Edward Pritchard killed 4 women. He confessed, he was convicted, he died in custody. But in the quiet corners of Brighton, among those who remember, or who've studied the case carefully, another story is sometimes told. A story of 2 killers, operating in parallel, their crimes intertwined in ways that made it impossible to separate them. One killer was caught. The other, if he existed at all, disappeared into history, his identity forever unknown. And that possibility, that a murderer walked away from the greatest manhunt in Brighton's history, remains the case's most chilling legacy. The question of whether Edward Pritchard acted alone, or whether Brighton suffered from 2 killers simultaneously has been debated by criminologists, journalists, and amateur sleuths for decades. The evidence, examined carefully, presents a troubling picture. Chapter 7. The weeks following Edward Pritchard's arrest in September of 1964 should have brought closure to Brighton. Instead, they brought new questions for those paying close attention. Detective Inspector Hartley spent those weeks completing the case file, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly documented and cataloged for the upcoming trial. It was during this meticulous review that he first noticed inconsistencies he'd been too exhausted to see during the frantic investigation. Morrison found him in the incident room late one night in October, surrounded by photographs and timeline charts spread across 3 tables. "Sir, you should go home," Morrison said. "The case is closed. Pritchard is locked up awaiting trial. We got him." Hartley didn't look up from the photographs he was studying. "Look at this," he said, gesturing Morrison closer. "These are the crime scene photos from all 4 murders. Tell me what you see." Morrison examined them carefully. 4 women, all killed the same way. Throat cut, shoes missing. Same killer, same method. "Look closer," Hartley insisted. "At the wounds specifically." Morrison leaned in. "They're all throat wounds. Deep cuts, left to right. But look at the depth and angle," Hartley said, pulling out the post-mortem reports. Dr. Clark noted in his reports that the first 3 victims had wounds that were almost identical in depth, angle, and execution. But the 4th victim, Margaret Walsh, her wound was slightly different, deeper on one side, shallower on the other, suggesting the blade was drawn at a different angle. "Could just be variation," Morrison suggested. "Even the same killer might not execute every murder identically." "Possible," Hartley agreed. "But there's more. Look at the locations where the bodies were found." He pointed to a map of Brighton Beach with 4 markers indicating the murder sites. The first 3 victims were all found within a half-mile radius, clustered around the Palace Pier and the area immediately to the east. But Margaret Walsh was found nearly a mile away, close to the Hove boundary. "Again, could just be circumstance," Morrison said, though he was beginning to sound less certain. "Now look at the times," Hartley continued. Dr. Clark estimated time of death for the first 3 victims as being between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. All within that window. But Margaret Walsh died earlier, between 9 and 11. Different pattern. Morrison sat down heavily in a chair. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure yet," Hartley admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe I'm seeing patterns that aren't there because I'm exhausted. But something feels off about the 4th murder." "Pritchard confessed to all 4, Morrison reminded him. "He confessed to killing 4 women, Hartley corrected. But his confession was vague on details. He said the voices told him to do it, that he couldn't remember specifics. He never provided information about the murders that only the killer would know." "What about the shoes?" Morrison asked. "We found all 4 pairs in his flat. We found 4 pairs of women's shoes," Hartley said. "But we never definitively matched them to the victims. We assumed they were the missing shoes because there were 4 pairs and 4 victims. But did we actually verify they belonged to Dorothy Hayes, Patricia Chambers, Susan Fletcher, and Margaret Walsh?" Morrison was silent for a moment. "I don't think we did. After Pritchard's confession and suicide attempt, everything moved so fast. The assumption was that the shoes were the victims, and no one thought to confirm it." Hartley made a note on his pad. "We need to have the families identify the shoes. Tomorrow." The next day, they visited each victim's family, showing them photographs of the shoes found in Pritchard's flat. 3 of the 4 families positively identified the shoes as belonging to their daughters. Dorothy Hayes' mother recognized the black pumps she'd bought her daughter for her birthday. Patricia Chambers' sister identified a pair of brown loafers Patricia wore constantly. Susan Fletcher's roommate confirmed the red flats Susan had been wearing the night she died. But Margaret Walsh's family couldn't identify any of the remaining shoes as belonging to her. Her sister, who'd helped police catalog Margaret's possessions, said the style wasn't something Margaret would have worn, and she was certain Margaret had been wearing her favorite black heels the night she disappeared, shoes that had never been found. This discovery troubled Hartley deeply. If the 4th pair of shoes didn't belong to Margaret Walsh, where had they come from? And where were Margaret's actual shoes? He brought his concerns to the chief constable, who listened with growing impatience. "Inspector, you've caught the killer," the chief constable said. He confessed. "We have physical evidence. The case is closed. The public is satisfied. The Home Office is satisfied. I'm satisfied. Why are you trying to create problems where none exist?" "Because I don't think we have the full truth," Hartley replied. "There are too many inconsistencies regarding the 4th victim." "Inconsistencies can be explained," the chief constable said dismissively. "Perhaps Mrs. Walsh's family is mistaken about her shoes. Perhaps Dr. Clark's time of death estimate was off. Perhaps Pritchard varied his methods slightly with the 4th victim. These are minor details that don't change the fundamental facts of the case." "Sir, with respect—" "No, Inspector," the chief constable interrupted. "I've been patient with you because you've done excellent work on this investigation. But now you're exhausted and second-guessing yourself. Take some time off. Rest. When you come back, we'll discuss your next assignment. But this case is closed. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Hartley said quietly. He returned to his office and sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the case files. Every instinct told him something was wrong, but he had no power to pursue it further. The machine of justice was in motion, and it would not be stopped for his doubts. The trial proceeded as scheduled in March of 1965. Hartley testified as required, presenting the evidence professionally and thoroughly. But he said nothing about his concerns regarding Margaret Walsh's murder. To do so would have undermined the prosecution's case, and potentially allowed Pritchard to escape justice for the crimes he definitely had committed. Hartley rationalized his silence by telling himself that even if Pritchard hadn't killed Margaret Walsh, he'd certainly killed the other 3 women. He deserved to be convicted and imprisoned. Justice, even imperfect justice, was better than no justice at all. But the guilt of that silence would haunt him for the rest of his life. Chapter 8. Edward Pritchard's life before the murders revealed a pattern of mental illness inadequately treated and opportunities for intervention that were missed. After the trial, Hartley obtained access to Pritchard's medical records and personal history, hoping to understand what had created a killer. What he discovered was a tragic story of a man failed by the mental health system. Pritchard had been born in Birmingham in 1928, the only child of factory worker parents. His childhood had been unremarkable until his teenage years, when he began exhibiting symptoms of mental illness. He heard voices, experienced paranoid delusions, had difficulty distinguishing reality from his internal experiences. At 19, he'd suffered a complete breakdown and been admitted to a psychiatric hospital. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and treated with the limited medications available in 1947. After 3 months, he was released with instructions to follow up with outpatient treatment. But Pritchard never followed up. He moved to London, then to Brighton, drifting from job to job, managing his symptoms as best he could through sheer willpower. He learned to hide his illness, to present a functional exterior while chaos reigned in his mind. According to co-workers at the shipping company where he'd worked for the last 8 years before his arrest, Pritchard had been a quiet but competent employee. He showed up on time, did his work without complaint, never caused problems. No one suspected the torment he was experiencing internally. His landlady, Mrs. Forsyth, described him as the perfect lodger until the murders began. He paid rent promptly, kept his room clean, made no noise. If he was hearing voices commanding him to kill, he showed no outward signs of it. This ability to function despite severe mental illness made Pritchard particularly dangerous. He appeared normal enough that no one thought to intervene, yet disturbed enough to commit horrific violence. But what triggered the escalation from managing his illness to acting on his violent impulses? Hartley studied Pritchard's timeline carefully, looking for the precipitating event. He found it in April of 1964, 2 months before the first murder. Pritchard's mother had died suddenly of a heart attack. He'd traveled to Birmingham for the funeral, then returned to Brighton more isolated than ever. His mother had been his only remaining family connection, the only person who knew about his mental illness and checked on him regularly. Without that anchor, Pritchard had spiraled. The voices, which he'd managed to keep at a tolerable level for years, grew louder and more insistent. His paranoia intensified, and when he encountered Dorothy Hayes walking alone on the beach that June night, the voices told him she was a threat that needed to be eliminated. After killing her, Pritchard experienced temporary relief. The voices quieted, but within days they returned, more demanding than before. The cycle had begun, and he couldn't stop it. Hartley interviewed Dr. Ashworth, the psychiatrist who'd examined Pritchard for the trial, asking him to elaborate on the killer's mental state. Pritchard is what we call a disorganized schizophrenic, Dr. Ashworth explained. His thoughts are chaotic, his grip on reality is tenuous, but paradoxically, he's also capable of moments of lucidity and planning. It's this combination that makes such individuals so dangerous and so difficult to identify before they commit violence. Could he have worked with an accomplice? Hartley asked. Someone else who committed similar crimes? Dr. Ashworth considered this. Unlikely. Individuals with Pritchard's level of paranoia and delusion typically can't form the trust necessary for criminal partnerships. He would have seen any potential accomplice as a threat. So you believe he acted alone? Based on my evaluation of him, yes, Dr. Ashworth said. But I can only speak to his psychological profile, not to the physical evidence of the crimes. This conversation left Hartley more confused than ever. The psychological evidence suggested Pritchard acted alone, but the physical evidence suggested otherwise. He decided to approach the problem from a different angle. If there had been a second killer, who might it have been? He reviewed all the suspects they'd investigated during the original inquiry. Men who'd been questioned and cleared. Men who'd been seen near the crime scenes but had alibis. Men whose behavior had raised suspicions, but never enough to justify arrest. One name stood out: Thomas Crawford. Crawford had been interviewed early in the investigation after being reported for suspicious behavior by several witnesses. He was a 34-year-old drifter who'd arrived in Brighton in May of 1964 and taken casual work at various locations around town. Multiple people had reported seeing Crawford watching women on the beach, following them at a distance, making them uncomfortable with his intense stares. When questioned, Crawford claimed he was just appreciating the scenery and meant no harm. He'd been interviewed again after the second murder, as police cast a wider net looking for potential suspects. Crawford had an alibi for the night Patricia Chambers was killed, provided by the landlord of the pub where he'd been drinking until closing time. Based on that alibi, Crawford had been eliminated as a suspect, but Hartley now wondered if that elimination had been premature. An alibi for one murder didn't necessarily mean innocence in the others. He tried to track down Thomas Crawford in late 1965, hoping to interview him again. But Crawford had left Brighton shortly after Pritchard's arrest, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. Hartley contacted police forces across Britain, asking if anyone had records of a Thomas Crawford matching the description. He received dozens of responses. There were Thomas Crawfords everywhere, and without more specific identifying information, tracking down the right one proved impossible. The trail went cold. If Crawford had been a second killer, he'd vanished successfully. Chapter 9. As the years passed and Hartley retired, the case faded from public consciousness, but never entirely disappeared. Periodically, it would resurface in newspapers marking anniversaries, or in true crime books examining famous British murders. In 1974, a book titled The Seaside Slasher, A Complete Account of the Brighton Beach Murders, was published by author Malcolm Price. It presented Pritchard's guilt as definitive and mocked the notion that there could have been any doubt. Hartley, reading the book in his retirement, was frustrated by its conclusive tone and lack of critical analysis. Price had access to trial transcripts and police reports, but had apparently never questioned the official narrative. He wrote a letter to the publisher, outlining his concerns about the case, and suggesting that Price had oversimplified a complex investigation. The publisher never responded. In 1978, the BBC produced a television documentary about the case as part of a series on famous British criminal investigations. Hartley was interviewed, and for the first time publicly, he mentioned his doubts about whether all 4 murders had been committed by the same person. The documentary included his comments, but framed them as the understandable second thoughts of a dedicated detective who wanted to ensure every detail was examined. The narrator's voiceover essentially dismissed Hartley's concerns as overthinking, but one viewer took Hartley's comments seriously. Catherine Walsh, a young journalist at The Observer, contacted Hartley after seeing the documentary. She wanted to investigate his theory more thoroughly. Their collaboration, which began in 1985, marked the first serious re-examination of the case. Catherine was relentless, tracking down witnesses who'd never been properly interviewed, obtaining documents that had been buried in archives, asking questions that should have been asked 20 years earlier. She discovered that Thomas Crawford, the suspicious drifter who'd left Brighton after Pritchard's arrest, had died in Glasgow in 1979. A routine check of his possessions after death had revealed a collection of newspaper clippings about the Brighton beach murders, carefully preserved in a scrapbook. Why would a man who was supposedly cleared of suspicion keep such detailed records of crimes he hadn't committed? Catherine asked Hartley when she shared this discovery. Hartley had no good answer. The collection could be explained as morbid fascination, the kind of interest many people had in famous crimes, but combined with Crawford's suspicious behavior in Brighton during the summer of 1964, it suggested something more sinister. Catherine also tracked down Janet Cooper, the witness who'd reported seeing a suspicious man near the Palace Pier on the night Susan Fletcher was murdered. Cooper's testimony had been used to place Pritchard at the scene, but Catherine's interview revealed doubts Cooper had never been able to express in court. "I saw a man that night," Cooper told Catherine, "but I was never completely certain it was Pritchard. The man I saw was slimmer, I think, and moved differently. When I picked Pritchard out of the lineup, I chose the person who most closely resembled my memory. But resemblance isn't certainty." Catherine documented everything, building a file that rivaled Hartley's in thoroughness. In 1987, she published her series of articles in The Observer, creating the first major public discussion of the possibility that Pritchard might not have acted alone. The response was mixed. Some readers were intrigued by the evidence Catherine presented. Others accused her of sensationalism, of reopening wounds for the victims' families, of undermining confidence in the justice system. The families themselves had varied reactions. Dorothy Hayes's family maintained that they believed Pritchard had killed all 4 women and resented the suggestion otherwise. Patricia Chambers's family declined to comment. Susan Fletcher's parents, both still alive in 1987, said they'd always had doubts about aspects of the case, but had never felt comfortable expressing them. Margaret Walsh's family was the most vocal in supporting Catherine's investigation. Her sister, Caroline Walsh Miller, who'd never been entirely satisfied with the official explanation, provided Catherine with detailed information about Margaret's last days and the inconsistencies she'd noticed at the time. Margaret was terrified in the weeks before she died, Caroline told Catherine. She said someone had been following her. She'd seen the same man several times, always at a distance, always watching. She reported it to the police, but they told her it was probably just her imagination, that she was frightened because of the murders and seeing threats where none existed. Catherine obtained the police report Margaret had filed 2 weeks before her death. It described a man in his 30s, average height, who seemed to be following her route home from work. The description didn't match Pritchard, who was then 36, and had a distinctive appearance that multiple witnesses had noted. Why hadn't this report been connected to the murder investigation? Catherine wondered. The answer seemed to be that by the time Margaret was killed, the police were so focused on Pritchard as the prime suspect that other potential leads were ignored. The Home Office inquiry launched in 1988 reviewed all of this evidence. The panel included retired judges, forensic experts, and criminal psychologists. They spent months examining every aspect of the case, conducting new forensic analysis where possible, and interviewing surviving witnesses. Their conclusion, while carefully worded, essentially validated Hartley's concerns. The report stated that while Edward Pritchard was undoubtedly guilty of at least 2 murders, and probably 3, there was insufficient evidence to conclusively determine he had committed all 4 murders attributed to him. The panel noted particular concerns about Margaret Walsh's murder, the differences in location, timing, wound characteristics, and the shoes that didn't match all suggested this killing might have been the work of someone else. But who? Without additional physical evidence or witness testimony, the inquiry couldn't identify an alternative suspect. Thomas Crawford's suspicious behavior and obsessive interest in the case were noted, but without proof, no posthumous accusations could be made. The inquiry recommended that Sussex police keep the case file open and continue to investigate any new leads that might emerge. In practical terms, This meant little, as no active investigation was conducted, but it represented an official acknowledgement that the case wasn't as cleanly solved as had been claimed. Chapter 10. The final years of William Hartley's life were spent in quiet contemplation of the case that had defined his career. He maintained his home office filled with files, photographs, and maps, occasionally receiving visits from researchers or journalists interested in his perspective. His wife Margaret had died in 1988, leaving him alone in the house they'd shared for 40 years. His children, both living far from Brighton, worried about his isolation and his continued obsession with the murders. But Hartley found purpose in his unofficial role as the keeper of the case's memory. He corresponded with criminologists studying serial killers, with historians researching Brighton's past, with true crime enthusiasts fascinated by unsolved mysteries. In 1991, a year before his death, Hartley gave his final interview about the case to a researcher named David Thornton, who was writing a doctoral thesis on serial murder investigations in 20th century Britain. The interview took place in Hartley's home office, surrounded by the accumulated documentation of decades of investigation. "Do you still believe there were two killers?" Thornton asked, his tape recorder running. Hartley took a long moment before answering. "I believe Edward Pritchard killed Dorothy Hayes, Patricia Chambers, and Susan Fletcher. The evidence for those crimes is overwhelming, but Margaret Walsh's murder doesn't fit. Too many details are wrong. Either Pritchard changed his methodology significantly for that one killing, which is possible, but unusual for this type of offender, or someone else killed her." "If someone else killed her, why?" Thornton pressed. "What would be the motive?" "That's what I've never been able to determine," Hartley admitted. "There are several possibilities. It could have been a copycat, someone who saw an opportunity to commit murder and have it blamed on the seaside slasher. It could have been someone who knew Margaret personally and used the situation to settle a grudge. Or it could have been another disturbed individual who was operating simultaneously with Pritchard. Pure coincidence that their crimes overlapped." "Which theory do you believe?" Hartley sighed. "After all these years, I honestly don't know. I've investigated every angle I can think of. I've followed every lead available to me, and I still can't say with certainty what happened to Margaret Walsh." "Does that haunt you?" Thornton asked gently. "Every day," Hartley replied. "I spent my career seeking truth and justice. In this case, I achieved justice, or part of it, but the full truth has eluded me. That's the burden I'll carry to my grave." He did exactly that. William Hartley died in February of 1992, at age 79, of heart failure. His funeral was attended by family, former colleagues, and several journalists who'd worked with him on the Brighton Beach case over the years. Peter Morrison, who'd served as Hartley's sergeant during the original investigation and remained his friend through retirement, delivered a eulogy that captured Hartley's dedication and torment. "Bill Hartley was the finest detective I ever worked with," Morrison said. "He was thorough, intelligent, and deeply committed to justice. The Brighton Beach case was solved because of his leadership. 4 families received some measure of closure because of his work. But Bill could never quite accept that closure himself. He always felt there was more to discover, more truth to uncover. Some might call that obsession. I call it dedication to a standard most of us can never match." After Hartley's death, his family donated his extensive case files to the Sussex Police Museum, where they remain available for researchers. The files fill 3 large boxes and contain not just official documents, but Hartley's personal notes, his theories, his doubts, and his unanswered questions. Scholars who've studied these files have noted the painstaking thoroughness of Hartley's work. Every statement was verified. Every piece of evidence was examined from multiple angles. Every timeline was checked and rechecked. And yet, despite all that effort, the central question remains unanswered. Were all 4 Brighton Beach murders committed by Edward Pritchard? Or did a second killer operate in the shadows of that terrible summer, escaping justice while Pritchard took the blame? Epilogue. The unanswered question. In the decades since the Brighton Beach murders, advances in forensic science have transformed criminal investigation. DNA analysis, digital forensics, psychological profiling, all tools that weren't available to Hartley and his team in 1964. In 2015, Sussex police announced they would conduct a cold case review of the Brighton Beach murders using modern forensic techniques, physical evidence that had been preserved in storage for 50 years, including the murder weapon and the clothing worn by victims, would be reanalyzed. The review took 3 years. In 2018, The results were published in a comprehensive report available to the public. The DNA analysis was disappointing. Decades of storage had degraded much of the biological evidence, making definitive conclusions impossible. However, the analysis that could be performed confirmed that Edward Pritchard's DNA was present on items associated with 3 of the 4 victims. Significantly, no DNA evidence linked Pritchard to Margaret Walsh. This could mean he wasn't her killer, or it could simply mean that the evidence from her case had degraded more than the others, or that he'd been more careful with that particular crime. The review also included modern psychological profiling of the crimes. Criminal psychologists examined the case files and provided their assessment. Their conclusions supported what Hartley had suspected. The first 3 murders showed clear evidence of an organized serial killer following a consistent pattern. The 4th murder, while superficially similar, showed subtle differences suggesting either a significant change in the killer's methodology or a different perpetrator entirely. The fact that the murders stopped after Pritchard's arrest, the psychologist noted, could support either theory. If Pritchard was the only killer, his removal would naturally end the murders. But if there were 2 killers, the second one might have stopped out of fear after seeing his partner caught, or might have simply left Brighton, or might have been satisfied with his single kill. The cold case review concluded with the same careful language as the 1989 Home Office inquiry. Edward Pritchard was definitely guilty of murdering at least 3 women, but questions remained about the 4th victim. The case officially remains open. Sussex police maintain a file and continue to accept tips or new information, but no active investigation is being conducted, and no additional arrests are expected. For the families of the 4 victims, the ambiguity is frustrating. Dorothy Hayes, Patricia Chambers, Susan Fletcher, and Margaret Walsh all deserve definitive answers about who killed them and why. Instead, they have partial justice and lingering doubts. The Brighton community has memorialized the victims through various means. The memorial plaque on the seafront is visited regularly by local residents and tourists interested in true crime history. An annual vigil is held on June 15th, the anniversary of Dorothy Hayes' murder, to remember all 4 women. In 2020, a podcast titled The Seaside Slasher Revisited examined the case over 12 episodes, interviewing historians, forensic experts, and relatives of those involved. The podcast generated renewed interest in the case and prompted several amateur investigators to offer their own theories. Some believe Pritchard killed all 4 women, and the inconsistencies are simply the result of flawed investigation techniques in 1964. Others are convinced a second killer existed, but successfully evaded capture. Still, others propose more elaborate theories involving multiple killers or conspiracy. The truth, as William Hartley knew, may never be fully revealed. Time has erased too many clues, claimed too many witnesses, degraded too much evidence. What remains is a fascinating and troubling case study in the limits of justice and the persistence of doubt. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Brighton Beach murders isn't the question of whether 1 killer or 2 was responsible. Perhaps it's the larger questions the case raises about mental illness, about the responsibility of society to identify and treat disturbed individuals before they become violent, about the challenges of investigating serial crimes with limited resources and technology. Edward Pritchard was a man failed by the mental health system, left to struggle alone with demons that eventually drove him to kill. Would those women still be alive if Pritchard had received proper treatment after his first breakdown? Would Margaret Walsh be alive if police had taken her report of being followed more seriously? These are uncomfortable questions without easy answers. But they're questions worth asking, even 60 years after the summer that terrorized Brighton. The beaches of Brighton are peaceful now. Families play in the sand where bodies once lay. Children laugh where screams once echoed. Life moves on, as it always does, leaving the past to fade into memory and legend. But on quiet mornings, when the tide is out and the beach is empty, some locals say they can still feel the presence of those 4 young women, forever 21, 23, 26, and 28, forever walking the sand in those final moments before darkness claimed them. Their names are remembered: Dorothy Hayes, Patricia Chambers, Susan Fletcher, Margaret Walsh, 4 women who came to Brighton seeking life, work, love, future. 4 women who found only death on a summer beach. And somewhere in the shadows of history, a question lingers. Was justice truly served that summer of 1964? Or did a killer walk away, anonymous and unpunished, his crimes attributed to another man. William Hartley died without knowing the answer. We may never know it either. And that uncertainty, that unresolved ending, may be the most disturbing aspect of the case. Some mysteries resist solution, no matter how much we wish otherwise. The Brighton Beach murders of 1964 remain, ultimately, a story without a definitive conclusion. A case solved, and yet somehow still open. A killer caught, and yet perhaps still unknown. The seaside slasher was stopped. Of that, we can be certain. But was he the only one? That question echoes across the decades, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. A reminder that sometimes the most important truths remain forever, just beyond our grasp.